immediately, but it does make me move my queen. I played queen g4, threatening the knight, kicking the knight, so the knight just pops back to f6, threatening the queen. Again, I don't have time to take this pawn over here because the queen is threatened. So I move back to queen g3. Now, at this point, I realized that he could just play knight h4 again, and my queen could move back here. I was actually seriously thinking that if he would do that, I might even just be willing to draw the game here. Obviously, if the position goes back and forth 3 times, it's considered a draw. I wasn't really that comfortable with my game at this point. I know my queen is kind of trapped out in space. I don't really have a lot of ammunition aiming at his king. Yes, I'd like a nice little kingside attack, but all I really have that's in a position to get anywhere close to his king right away are my bishop and queen. My knight is, with this pawn blocking up the middle, is kind of out of it. This rook is, can't really get involved in the action. This rook is way out. I don't really have any pawn pushes, especially with my queen out in front. So I was thinking that I'm really no better than even in this game, and I would have considered, and I'm not saying I would have done it, but I would have considered a draw in this position if he would have kept moving back and forth. But instead he plays bishop d4. Now he obviously figures if I move my bishop then he can double up my pawns. He could have done that earlier, but I guess he centralizes bishop, and of course he protects his knight for whatever that's worth. But he does leave this h-pawn hanging. I'm not exactly sure what his plan was or why he left it hanging, but he did. So of course I played bishop take h6. Now he plays knight h5. A, threatening the queen, and B, threatening and protecting the mate square over here, which is g7. So I have to move my queen. I play queen g4, threatening the knight. Then he plays something which probably is why he allowed me to do this in the first place. He let me get a pawn, but he plays rook e6. Now, first of all, this pawn over here obviously is in no danger because now it's protected twice. It's protected by his knight, by virtue of his knight moving to here, but also that freed up a defense on the part of his bishop. So he moves his rook over here. Now, obviously, he leaves this knight hanging, but then he takes the bishop. And then he's won a bishop for a knight. My attack has really been, thwarted, and also he's got a rook on this file over here, which could be dangerous for me eventually. So I played bishop g5, threatening the queen. I did not want to, lose that bishop. Obviously, that bishop right now is my sole attacking piece with the queen, so I didn't want to lose it. I really wanted him to move this. If he moves this pawn up to defend the queen, then that would I think that would be a weakening move on his part because of the fact that he would create another pawn weakness on his queen side. Of course, he could move the bishop back to defend, but then he, well. Remember, this knight is hanging. Now, if he moves the bishop back and then I take it, then he can retake, and that's protected by the queen, so he really doesn't lose anything. But so instead, he plays knight f6. Now, I thought about this move for a while. I considered a whole bunch of different moves. I considered moving the rook to d1, getting this rook involved. I considered moving the queen back. Obviously, I am worried about this pawn being doubled over here. If he trades off this bishop for this knight, then I have those isolated c-pawns that we were discussing earlier. This queen is no longer defending the knight, which it was a little bit earlier. Instead of doing that, I decided to play queen h4. What this does, a couple of things. First of all, it puts my queen on a very powerful open h-file. Number two, it doubles up on the knight. Now, right now, the knight is being defended a ton of times. I mean, the knight is being defended by this pawn, by this rook, by this bishop, and by this queen, so that's not much of an issue. In fact, he can move the queen at any time, but I think to reinforce that attack on the knight eventually should have become important. I figured it was worth it. He plays queen e7, doubling up on this pawn over here. Again, he can't take it with the knight yet, even though now, before that, it was attacked by 2 pieces and defended by 2 pieces, although this knight was pinned. So he, I think, is planning eventually to play bishop takes knight, then I take back with the b pawn, and then this pawn is going to hang, because this pawn would be attacked by 1, 2, 3 pieces after the queen moves over here, and would only be defended by 2 pieces. So I played rook a d1, threatening the bishop. What I figured was, again, this is probably one of the moves that I took the longest amount of time to analyze. I figured, yes, let him take the knight. and let me take back with the pawn. Because I figured if he wanted to go take the central pawns, he wanted to go work on the central pawns, I was willing to let him have that because I figured that I could get an attack going on the king side. And my plan, no matter what he did with the bishop, was to rook lift, to get a rook lift on one of these rooks and swing it over to the h-file. And once I swing it over to the h-file, I figured I would have a nasty attack going down, going down against his king. So he's got to move this bishop one way or the other. Right now it's hanging. So he moves it back to e5, keeping in the middle, again, for the time being, stopping up his, his attack on my e-pawn. But, slicing into my king side a little bit, keeping the threat open on this knight. So now, I continue with my plan. Rook e3. Why not rook d3? Again, if the bishop still was threatening this diagonal, that's what I might have thought about playing. But because I knew that I wanted to get one of the rooks over to the h-file. So why did I choose this rook and not this rook? Very simple. Because I realized he had a very powerful battery coming down the e-file. At some point or another, this pawn might disappear, maybe this pawn would force it out, this knight would take it, something would happen to get this pawn out of the way. And I realized if the rook were still on the e-file, that would be a very powerful pin against this pawn. For example, let's say this bishop weren't there, and he would move up this pawn over here. I couldn't take it, because then he would have an attack on this rook over here. Now, as it is, with this rook over here, it's much harder for him to cause, let's say, a back rank mate over here. Because now, let's say, if I move this pawn up, I'd have this square defended by my queen also. Also, I can move the king over one spot. It's a lot easier to defend something it's a lot easier to defend a rank with none of your pieces on it than it is with a piece sitting on it. Because with a piece sitting on it, if it gets opened up to attack, it's much more powerful. I don't know if I'm explaining that very well, but I wanted to get if I wanted to get one rook off of the back rank, I wanted it to be this rook rather than this one, because this was a much more effective protector of this square than this was if it were sitting on it. So he moves his queen back to e8. He does that to alleviate the pin. On the knight over here. So now it's time. Now I swing my rook over to h3. And this is where he made his critical mistake. Obviously, I'm threatening checkmate on h8 over here. So what can he do about this? He can't just move this pawn up or anything like that, because it's not going to defend against the mate on h8. He can't move this pawn, which would normally be a flight square for his king, because the knight is blocking it. What he could have done was he could have moved the king over to f8, which probably would have been his best move over here. If he does that, I'd continue to build up the pressure. Again, I'm not 100% sure exactly what I'd do. Maybe I'd push the c pawn, try to put some pressure on his rook. His king would be trapped over there. If this knight would ever move, then the back rank would be a mate, because that would defend his flight square over here. And if he would try to get the king and literally run away by going to f8 and then e7 and then d7 or something like that, that would take so long that I would have I think I would have opportunities to to press the attack a little more. So he panicked a little bit. He plays knight h5. Now once he plays knight h5, he loses the knight for nothing. Now he opens up an escape square for his king, by allowing this f pawn to move, but he loses the knight. So I played queen take h5. Now of course he can prevent the mate by g6. He also could have prevented it by e6. I'm sorry, he also could have prevented it by f6, I'm sorry. Of course, what that does, the reason why it defends the mate is, of course, it it allows this bishop to defend the h8 square. So, I continue to queen h7 check. Obviously, he only has one move. Queen f8. Now, so now, the next thing is, if I play bishop to h6 check, then he just escapes with the king. He escapes to the e-file, and then to the e-file, and then to the d-file, and then he runs away. So instead, I wanted to put a little bit more pressure on his center. Obviously, the whole time, one thing I'm always worrying about over here is I don't want to get back rank mated. If I'm not careful over here, if this pawn and this bishop disappear, then he comes down here with his rook, it's check, and then it's checkmate. There's nothing else I can do about that. But I figured now it's time to put some pressure on the bishop. by